Welcome to Inside the Bible, produced at Andrews University. I'm joined today on set by my good friends, Felicia Dennis and Andrew Abbott.
So, have you liked our Facebook pages yet? Well, you can. Go on facebook.com/InsideTheBible and connect with us. Let us know your thoughts, your questions. Give us feedback, and also invite your family and friends to join us on this journey as well.
Today, we will talk about the Israelite nation that God led out of Egypt. We will look at the laws that God gave them, the covenant or agreement that God made with His people, and the religious ceremonies that demonstrated their allegiance to God. Religious groups always have various features that include rituals, sacred writings, laws, and a particular social structure that holds the community together. And the Israelites are no exception.
How can we understand God's concept of freedom if He is the one imposing the rules? How can understanding the journey, the context, and the spirituality of the Exodus help us to have a clearer picture of what the Bible means by God's people?
A great question deserves great answers. Let's go into the investigation.
The desert journey for the Israelites was full of challenges and close calls. Probably the close call that comes to mind right at first is the Red Sea crossing, where the Israelites were pressed up against the seashore by the charging Egyptians, and God had to open a way for them at the last minute through the waves of the Red Sea. But it seems like immediately after that amazing miracle, the Israelites showed short-term memory, because right afterwards they are complaining that Moses has intentionally brought them out into the desert to starve them to death in the middle of the sands of the wilderness. Why did God lead them into this other route as well, this more southerly route that took them away from the direction they were originally planning to go towards the north? And how was God going to transform this band of fugitives into a nation of conquerors who would someday bless all the nations of the world? Robert and I sat down with several theologians to discover some intriguing answers.
What are some of the challenges that the people of Israel are facing now, along with Moses, along this journey out of Egypt?
Well, some of the context is, for example, they've just witnessed some of the most incredible miracles we have in the whole Bible. The Red Sea's been split, Egyptian army destroyed. Now Egypt is behind them, the Red Sea's behind them. They're independent for the first time in 400 years. They're not slaves to anybody. Mm-hmm. And as you were just pointing out, they don't know where they're going. God is leading them and they're kind of following, and He says, go to this mountain and I'll give you further instruction.
You can kind of see the mentality that's kind of developed around them at this time too, because it's like they don't know where their food's going to come from, so they're like crying out to God, please give us food. And obviously they're in the desert, so there's no other place to get it. But it's like they've depended on their taskmasters, on the Egyptians all this time, and now they're in this state where, whoa, we're actually out in the middle of the desert all by ourselves. Where are we going to get the resources? And they're just start complaining at the drop of a hat, it seems like.
Imagine what it's like for Moses. He's gone from being a shepherd to all of a sudden being the man in charge, the president of an unorganized nation. Okay? I mean, in other words, there's just no structure to the nation. There's just no, and so God actually has to take control of that. God actually has to give them structure, has to give them laws. God has to. So imagine what's going on through his mind when they're leaving Egypt. I mean, what am I going to do, Lord? I mean, I've got nothing to give these people. At the same time, don't forget that there's people around in this group who have fallen in love with Egypt so much they don't want to leave. You know, they're leaving excellent positions behind in order for them to actually go and follow Moses, who has no idea as to where they're going. So I could just imagine the mindset right now. You know, oh my
Lord. It would have been incredibly difficult for some of the people. Absolutely, absolutely.
And these are people who they themselves don't really know, in many cases don't trust this God yet, and so they're looking to Moses like, well, you go talk to him. I don't want to talk to him. And so like all this burden is on him.
Imagine, I mean, and also the fact that they just have no land to call home. I can't remember which one of you guys mentioned that. They have no home. They're leaving security. I mean, yeah, it's slavery, but at the same time, that's their security blanket. You know, you're going somewhere, you're going to go, literally, you're going to go take over somebody's land, because in order for you to inherit that land, you have to take it over. So I could just imagine what is going through their minds. Because you have to fight, at this point in time, the context is, anything you want, you have to fight for it.
It's like they're going across no man's land, in a way.
Exactly. Yeah, and freedom is a beautiful thing, but freedom is a terrifying thing at the same time. You know, what are we going to do?
It's responsibility that comes with it.
Exactly.
The Hebrews were people who had lived for centuries on the Nile River. This was a place of prosper. It was a place where wheat grew. You could just throw some seeds out on the ground and by next spring, you know, the wheat would be there. It was so fertile that almost anything could grow in that climate. And it still does today. They grow everything. Cotton, wheat, they grow bananas, strawberries, anything that you want to grow in modern day Egypt, you can grow it there. That's what the Hebrews were familiar with. They also had wonderful plains where there were grasslands, which they had their flocks of sheep and goats and cattle. So they were used to a place that was sort of green. They knew where the desert was. It was dry there. They could see it. But they were used to being in this very comfortable environment. And they always had a constant supply of water. And then Moses takes them into the Sinai. Now the Sinai is nothing like being near the Nile River, nothing like the Delta, because there is almost nothing that's green, very limited vegetation, very little that you could feed your cattle on, very little water. Only in a few oases can you find water. And with all of these people leaving ancient Egypt, it's no wonder that they were really complaining about not having enough water, not having enough food, needing to rely on this manna stuff. What is this manna? It was an extremely uncomfortable situation for them. They have left Egypt, they've left everything that they know, but they've also left the gods of ancient Egypt behind. They had relied on these gods for generations, and now they're out in the middle of the desert, and they are wanting to know, okay, who is going to protect us? How do we know that we are safe? So God had a plan to try to show them who was protecting them. And in that plan, he developed the tabernacle.
The temples is a very Egyptian kind of approach.
What came to their mind when they thought of a temple? You know, that was probably what they had always seen earlier on.
Indeed, there are many examples of similar temples, and just like this one, in other parts of the ancient Near East, including in ancient Egypt.
Do you think that when it comes to rituals and doctrines that they can make you more spiritual? And if so, in what way?
I think that they can, and I think that things like the doctrines, they're all Bible-based. So I think that it's important that we follow all of them. I think that that's important.
Sometimes some of the rituals can be helpful. I mean, while recognizing that the rituals are rituals to actually help what's more important, I think the rituals can help.
Rituals, maybe not all the time.
Okay.
But if they are biblically sound doctrines for spirituality, yes.
Rituals and whatnot, a lot of their purpose is, you know, to remember or to remind you And, you know, if that reminder is, you know, valid enough, I believe that it'll help me, leave an impression in my mind that, you know, I need to make, set a time and place to worship my Lord and Savior.
Sometimes we get too caught up in traditionalism and we do things and we don't even know why. And that doesn't necessarily help us, I think, all the time. But if your doctrines have a solid biblical foundation, then yeah, if you're doing it right, then yeah.
At least in our church, the doctrines that we hold are very rich in spirituality because they teach us about God. And you can't have spirituality without God. So I think they're essential, honestly, to a deeper spirituality.
All right. Many people have different views about church, something that it's not necessary. You don't have to go as long as I have a relationship with God. There are others who go to church very frequently, and it's as if their life revolves around church. I remember as a little kid, if I didn't go to church on a particular day, I felt as if something was missing. But what is the purpose of church? When we go inside the Bible, we realize that God commanded Moses to build a tabernacle, construct this tent, so that the people may know that God's presence was dwelling with them. Well, we're starting the journey and we're exploring more about what God asked them to build.
Let's move on now to God's vision for them in the form of worship. Right? He gets them to the place where he wants them to build a tent. And why? Why did God tell them to do this?
Well, it's interesting because up to that point, I've been reading about this, they had shied away from temples because this is the God who is everywhere. He's omnipresent. So confining God, so to speak, not really confining, but having a room where God supposedly is, didn't really make sense to them in that context. They had altars, is where they would worship God.
Okay.
But here,
the temples is a very Egyptian kind of approach.
Yeah.
In their context, you know, they would have had the temple to Ra and the temple to Osiris. And
what came to their mind when they thought of a temple? You know, that was probably what they had always seen earlier on.
But that wasn't the only way they saw God either. They saw God in other ways too. I'm thinking about the pillar, right, and the cloud by day.
Not just that. I mean, you've got to remember that God, every single day, for 40 years. Okay, he fed them the manna. Every single day they would go out and collect these things. You know, the pillar of fire, the pillar of cloud. This was a present, everyday thing for them. I mean, imagine also when they're instituting the sacrifice system. There's fire that comes from heaven and boom, burns up the sacrifice. You know, and for them it was very important to keep that fire burning. So you know, it was very important for them to keep that picture of God, I think, present. Why? Because every nation had a God. You know, every city had a God. So for them, I imagine that it was very important for them to keep a picture of a God.
The Hebrews needed to worship. They needed to express that worship. They needed to express their devotion to God. In the past, they had probably expressed that devotion to the Egyptian gods. God needed to re-educate them as to what worship meant. Now, the Bible says that Moses was shown the tabernacle, perhaps in a dream or a vision, but it was a design that God handed to him directly. What might surprise you is that the tabernacle and its design was not unique. Indeed, there are many examples of similar temples, and just like this one, in other parts of the ancient Near East, including in ancient Egypt. In ancient Egypt, what took place in there, we now know because of papyrus, which gave instructions to the priests. What we know is that in that space there was a god. That's where the statue of the god was. And then there was something known as a bark. And that was sort of a boat or a wooden structure in which the god was placed. And then one day a year, at a festival for that god, the priest would take the bark, which had these rods that looked very similar to what you think of when you think of the Ark of the Covenant, and then they would carry that through the town. So in that moment, every ancient Egyptian could see who their god was, and they'd cry and they'd wail, they would sing songs and hymns and so on those special days. And this is very similar to what we see in the tabernacle service as well. Why? Not because the Egyptians had it right, but rather because God knew that if he was to show them who he was, he had to use the symbols, and he had to use the system that they were familiar with. So he had a holy place and a most holy place. So he had a courtyard, a place where people could gather to sing hymns, to offer sacrifice. All of this was true in all of the ancient temples of Egypt, including things like the furniture that was inside, a place where the bread was placed, a lamp, in this case the 7-branched or the 9-branched candlestick. That was something that was not unique to the ancient Hebrews. There was a need for light in every temple, but it had special symbolic meaning that the Hebrews would not even understand until much later, as it took time for God to explain over the centuries what this worship really meant and what it was for, and how it was different from where they had been in ancient Egypt.
Israel has become God's people, and by means of the covenant, Israel has become God's family.
The God of the Bible, he's coming down. We are not going up to him.
It's like the opposite of what we saw in the pagan temples that you're talking about. An Israelite would have seen a tent as possible living quarters, but a tent could also serve as a good meeting place in those times. This particular tent, the sanctuary, was not just a meeting place, though. It also had great symbolic significance. The materials, the structure, the colors, the furniture, the location, many of these different features represented something deeper. And we still cherish symbols today in the church. Crosses, pulpits, tables, candles, bread. These all remind us of Jesus' life. And some of these can also be traced back to the Israelite sanctuary. Today we're talking about specifically the sanctuary during the Exodus, when Moses and the Israelites are traveling to Canaan, and they have this structure that they're taking with them that is specifically ordered by God and directed by God from Mount Sinai. But when we look at the sanctuary and all the different articles, all the different rooms, the features that are there, is there some correlation here that we can see between that sanctuary and between the other temples that we can see in the nations around Israel, in the nations that weren't worshiping God but had temples that maybe had a similar structure, we could say?
Well, firstly, thank you for inviting me to Inside the Bible.
Yes, for sure.
And you are very right. When we study the archaeologists' finding regarding some sanctuary, we find many similarities. For example, we found like a holy place, we find a most holy place, and we have like the courtyard. So one of the questions that most of the time we ask ourselves is, what happened? Because the Bible says in Exodus 25, verse 8, that the sanctuary built by Moses was according to the sanctuary in heaven. So now the question is Moses received that sanctuary like a copy? And now he's building that sanctuary. Why? It was a revelation. Why? It is so similar to the one it was at that time, before him even. But there is still some difference that we need to take into account. For example, there is something that you will be interested in. Most of the time, the ancient world, the sanctuary was built in the top of the mountain. And there was a reason. The reason was that if you are very high, it means that you are closest to God.
Because they were in heaven. They were in the sky. So they're supposed to be.
That's why we have, like in Genesis 11 with the tower, they want to get a big tower. They want to build that big tower so they can be close to God. And that way they are saying, oh, you know what? We don't need the protection of anybody because we already have a God. And we are just in the same sphere that He is already. So that's why the Tower of Babel was in some way like a challenge against God. In Exodus 25, verse 8, the reason for the sanctuary was that God can dwell upon the people. So it is in some way, God is going to be close to the people.
It's like the opposite of what we saw in the pagan temples that you're talking about, where they're trying to come up to God, but here God is coming down to them.
Exactly, that's very interesting. Yeah, in the Bible, the God of the Bible, He's coming down. We are not going up to Him. So that's a big difference when we want to compare the ritual service in the ancient Eastern temple with the one in the Bible.
So God asked Moses and Israel to build a sanctuary for Him. I think there were at least two important purposes. One of them was that God wanted to move in with Israel. Israel has become God's people, and by means of the covenant, Israel has become God's family. So God is now a neighbor of Israel. They are more than friends, they are relatives now. The second reason God asked Israel to build a sanctuary is because the sanctuary was in fact a living illustration of what God wanted to do for Israel. So all the sacrifices, all the pilgrimages, all the ceremonies, the rituals, everything, even the structure of the sanctuary, everything was an illustration of the plan of redemption, of all the things God will do or would do to save humanity. Therefore, in the New Testament, you find that Jesus is described as the Lamb of God. It's the Lamb that takes away the sin of the world. Jesus is referred to as the Passover Lamb. And you have references to other feasts in the book of Revelation, in other places, as referring to what God wanted to do for Israel.
Exodus 29 gives us a picture of the daily function of the Israelite sanctuary in the Old Testament. This is the place where the Israelites offered their individual sacrifices for their sins. But there's also another function, the daily evening and morning sacrifices that the priest would offer for the forgiveness of those who had sinned during that day. And every morning and evening, that sacrifice symbolized the sacrifice that Jesus would eventually come and go through for His people to atone for their sins. But beyond that, there is also the functions within the sanctuary as well. Every morning and evening, there would be the burning of the incense. The incense was constantly wafting up towards the heavens throughout the day, but the priests would maintain it with incense burning every morning and evening. There was also the bread of the presence that was in the sanctuary as well, and that bread was replaced each Sabbath and eaten by the priests each Sabbath as well. And then there was the lampstand. The high priest was personally responsible for maintaining the lampstand and making sure that the flames were constantly lit and burning each hour of the day and night. And all these functions showed the forgiveness of God, the power of God, the mercy of God towards His people, and also pointed forward to Christ, whose life, whose death and resurrection would provide provision for the sins of the people and would pay the penalty that they deserved for their transgressions.
We saw today that God didn't force anyone to join Him and leave Egypt. Many did, but many didn't. This is a great example of the freedom of will that the Bible describes. We have the choices to join other people who have determined to do their best to follow God's will or not to. The Bible is actually a great book of liberty. It describes God as having made us and then giving us the choice to live in a way that enhances the quality of life that He created us to have. Life is naturally spiritual in one way or another. Either one chooses to enter into a relationship with God or one doesn't. But either way, this is a spiritual choice. The journey is yours to choose.
You said that right, Scotty. At the beginning of Israel's journey, God gave them the opportunity to choose and also reminded them of His original promise of a Redeemer by giving them the sanctuary. All the features of the sanctuary ultimately point to the one who will crush the serpent's head, the one who will conquer sin and pave the way back to God's original plan.
This has been an amazing journey, and I certainly hope that you enjoyed it. But we want to hear from you, so go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/InsideTheBible. Let us know your thoughts about the program. Send in your questions. And remember to invite your family and friends to join us on this journey.
I cannot agree any more with you two. Being included by God as part of His own people sounds like a tremendous privilege that, frankly, I'm not so sure I deserve. But that's the good news. What God does next in the story shows that it doesn't matter if I deserve it or not. He wants me. In fact, by studying the sanctuary, we can understand how God made it possible for all of us to join His family today.
I like that, Scotty, but at the same time, I have some questions. When the audience opens their Bible and they read about the sanctuary, then they move on beyond that, suddenly they encounter all these laws. And what about the 10 Commandments? All these laws that Moses wrote down. For Christians today, what place should they have in our lives?
And Moses' life doesn't even end in the sanctuary. As a matter of fact, we have 37 books left in the Old Testament before we get to Jesus' part.
You guys are right. I want more answers. What about you? Join us next season in our continual search for answers as we go inside the Bible.